You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back. In today's episode, we return to the discussion with Heather Tidwell and discussing the role of harm reduction and how important this can be. Heather shares insights into language used in this illness, and we discuss why this must change to be more supportive to our loved ones and families affected by this disease as a whole.
The Embrace Family Recovery Podcast.
So when we talked about harm reduction, I'd love you to tell the audience how you see that, with your motivational interviewing and the work you do when you have clients who are maybe resistant to abstinence or been through treatment, can't seem to have abstinence. How do you work with them? What's your philosophy and approach?
So when I think of harm reduction, I think of it almost as like a tool that I have in my toolbox. It's the idea that, and harm reduction has been around forever. Harm reduction in driving, seatbelts, harm reduction in swimming, lifeguards. It's this idea that people inherently engage in risky behaviors. And if we want them to be ideally as safe as possible, we need to be able to keep them alive.
I want to stop right there because that's so vital. You mentioned earlier, ER, it's treat them and street them.
Yep.
You mentioned the fact that we have to have them alive to give them an opportunity to access something different. Like that's the goal. That's our baseline, if you like, because obviously we're losing too many people unnecessarily to this illness. It's tragic. And I don't mean just opiates. I mean alcohol. I mean all of them and mental health issues. So what I love is what you just said. And I think it's so important to put a full stop period right there or an exclamation point. The goal is to keep people alive, to find their way to a wellness or a life that feels better for them. But if they're dead, God forbid, if they die, they can never have that. So I just want to make sure we hear it out there. I always say to my families, if they're breathing, we have hope.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that tritely at all. I mean that importantly. It's so incredibly important to have on hand Narcan if you know you have a loved one who has an opiate addiction. Because you don't know if fentanyl's in something, and having it on hand at home gives you a chance to intervene and keep them alive so that they can get whatever care they need. If you don't have it, you can't even offer that hope. Sorry, I went off on a tirade. Go ahead, take it.
Well, I'm glad that you did stop because I kind of said it and just kind of kept going. And when you were able just to stop and make that distinction of they have to be alive, like I had a physiological response and I got chills because it's true. And it's so important. And just to kind of understand that harm reduction isn't saying, yep, I'm giving permission, you go do all the things. What it's saying is, I want you to be alive so we can get the treatment, the help, and the space to get us to a healthier outcome. And it's interesting, when you were talking about Narcan and when you and I first met, I actually just went and did like some research and things like that. And it was the Coalition of Against Prescription Drug Abuse recommended anybody, whether they had prescription opioids or anything in their home, and yes, if they knew about addiction and they said if we knew somebody was going to get discharged, even if we don't think that they're using that substance and they're using other substance, have it at your house. Because now with like fentanyl, fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. You only have a short period of time. If somebody is getting something where maybe they think they're doing one substance, they're like, I don't need that. I would never touch that. It's kind of like the chocolate chip cookie analysis. Fentanyl only has to be in one little piece of that cookie. It doesn't have to be in like the whole thing. Using it once or twice can kill you, like your first time. It's scary.
It is scary. And I also want to back up because you keep giving these great glimmers, to use your word. The concept of if someone is in your world and you know they have the disease of addiction, it's one thing. If you are coming home with a prescription or you know there is one in the home, that's another thing. If someone's been in treatment, it doesn't mean you think they're going to relapse or return to use. And it's not giving permission for that. It's saying, I have it if I need it, God forbid something happens. And I like that because it reminds me of my prior work, going back to my first passion, which was HIV prevention and sex education when we were in the pandemic of AIDS. And it was treat everyone as if they have it to protect yourself from getting it, right?
Yes.
It's the same concept. It's not about permission giving. It is about teaching how to protect yourself in the event it could happen or it does happen. And this is clear to me. And I think that that's a really good reframe for me professionally to hear about harm reduction. I'm not opposed to it. I think it's vitally important. I also am a proponent of abstinence model, right? So I believe in that to my toe. But I think that one doesn't exclude the other.
It's messy, it really is. And I've worked with individuals where they were not ready for like abstinence whatsoever, but they knew like maybe they had 3 unintentional overdoses. They woke up in like the ER. They lost family members. I had one individual that lost their fiance after having to give him Narcan for the 3rd time. And I've worked with individuals where I've met them where they are. We've engaged in, some semblance of harm reduction for, I think this one individual I'm thinking about like 6 to 8 months. And now they're 2 years sober. Came to me and said, absolutely no way. I am never getting. Okay. I completely hear what you're saying. I acknowledge it. That being said, would you be open to listening to what some of my concerns are? How do we maybe make you just a little bit healthier? I mean, nobody wants to go to like the ER and get their stomach pumped. Like, how do we kind of look at just safety and what does that look like? And by that occurring, and this individual first met with me, was so anxious, didn't want to do Zoom, didn't want to meet in like person. So we did a phone call because he didn't want me to see his face. And we were able to work our way from that phone call to 2 years of like sobriety by meeting him where he was at and acknowledging, you are the expert on you. I'm your guide. Maybe I make some observations. Let's just talk. Let's have a conversation. You tell me what I need to know.
When you look at clients who are maintaining use, they're not in abstinence recovery, but they're maintaining their use and they're seeking your services. Because I can imagine if families out there listening thinking, okay, so how do you work with someone who's still using and make progress if we know that using impacts their ability to function?
No, it's hard and it's so individualized. It really is. And it's interesting too, because I'll get calls, just because I have like the background of working in the emergency room. I'll have emergency room doctors that like know me and they know I like branched off where they'll call me and they'll staff if I'll take somebody. I have other clinicians and peers where maybe they're working with somebody and they are concerned about their active use, but their active use does not warrant an involuntary commitment.
Right.
They're still going to be using. This clinician is like, this is outside of my scope. It's not safe for me to work with you. These are individuals I will assess them on a case by case basis. And I will work with them while they're actively using. We will talk about safety measures, about what a relationship looks like from an ethical and like HIPAA standpoint while they're using. And my main thing is while we are working, there has to just be, it's almost like a boundary of some place that we are working towards to increase safety, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's using fentanyl strips before using. Maybe it's not using alone, but this idea of what does it look like when, again, it's a gray area. It's not black and white. It's not the same for any individual that calls me. It's very gray. And often when I do get individuals that are referred to me, their acuity of use is usually more severe than what was reported to their primary care doctor or to their ED or to their family.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to your word messy, right? We're looking for a black and white solution for something that's gray and messy. And it's important to know that there are certain standards for wellness out there that some people do absolutely get and are blessed through their work to be able to achieve that. And then there are others who are struggling so bad to even go there, may not even want to go there and still want help. So how do you meet them where they're at? That's what I hear you saying so well.
Yeah. Again, it's rolling with their resistance. Most likely, I mean, if you go into an emergency room and if you have tracts, on like your arm, or if you're, with the new analog Zytruline, and if you have those type of wounds and kind of things like that, oftentimes people don't want to give you, and again, this is not me saying bad providers, it's culture, it's systems, but they don't want to give you the time of day. You've been treated like you're less than. You've been disconnected. So what I often do is right away, just kind of validate that, and when I used to do some addiction treatment, it used to be all court order. Mm-hmm. So you have to think about how resistant people there. Yep. Yeah. Whatever, just sign my paper, lady. And I'm like, all right. I'm like, it sounds like you're really frustrated. I get that. From looking here, it seems like this is your 10th time, working with a different clinician. I personally don't even know how you got through all of that with all different, and it's acknowledging them, it's hearing them, it's validating them, it's using their words, and it's kind of summarizing what they're saying. So she heard me. And one thing I always hear is, and again, this is not me saying bad clinicians, but when I work with individuals that have like moderate to severe addiction, they're like, if you tell me just to get sober, like every other flippin' person I've met with, I'm going to lose it. I'm like, yeah, that sounds, because we use for a reason. It's a coping skill. It's not an adaptive coping skill. It's a maladaptive coping skill, but there's usually a reason that we're using. Maybe we're using to forget something. Maybe we're using to numb ourselves. Maybe we're using because it's the only time that we feel that we can actually engage in social interactions. We need to be able to replace that maladaptive skill with something more positive and healthy. And it takes more than 24 hours.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
I am so excited to announce a retreat that I am hosting in Nashville, Tennessee in March of 2024. This is going to be a lot of fun. Myself and Dee Dee Armstrong will be in Nashville at a beautiful recording studio called Welcome to 1979, who have graciously offered to host us and have this retreat. And the retreat is about your ongoing recovery, how to lean in and gain tips and strategies to continue your growth in recovery. This retreat is open to anyone affected by the disease, whether we have the disease of addiction or whether we love someone who has the disease of addiction. It is going to be limited space of 30 people. So please get online. I will attach the links in the show notes below and find out more about the retreat in Nashville, which is happening the first weekend in March. And we are so excited to be going to Nashville and venturing from the Midwest to the East Coast and now heading into Tennessee. Hope to see you there. You won't be regretting the time you spend in building connection and learning new strategies for your own recovery.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
So I'm of the belief that the disease is a primary, progressive, chronic, and potentially fatal illness, and that not every one of us has the wiring to be addicted. And those of us who don't are spared. I do believe trauma can absolutely be an impact to and from addiction. I believe that when people use most often in the beginning, it is for social reasons. It's to be part of, or it's because it's accessible. I just recently had a conversation with someone who's written a memoir whose first awareness of pills making life better was 5 years old. And so we have a lot there to unpack. The thing that I can hear people saying was, how do you do that if someone's not clear-headed and sober?
And again, I think it's that intrinsic motivation for change, but also knowing and being flexible of when to work with like an individual. So again, this is that gray area. I was referred an individual mid to late 40s, acute alcohol addiction, drinking at the minimum 15 drinks a day, a combination of hard alcohol, beer, would usually start right when he woke up. History of being detoxed, but no inpatient, constantly refusing, had neuropathy, just a slew of stuff. He had a primary care doctor. He had a neurologist. His clinician then referred him to me because she was like, I'm stuck. Like there's been nothing. I don't think I can ethically work with him because I think he's going to kill himself. So him and I met for like 2 sessions. It became very apparent, again, for him, significant trauma. Saw his dad shoot himself, lots of more trauma since then, and just felt like nobody ever really listened to him. And all he wanted to do was process the trauma. And how I met him was, wow, how insightful are you that you know that? A lot of times we can't even make that connection. That being said, I hear that this is your goal. I, as a clinician, cannot ethically get you there because this addiction is so overpowering. If we start talking about trauma, it's just going to explode. And then we're talking about even more safety concerns. So what him and I did is we met at the time where he was the most sober that day, which for him was 9 a.m. We did a lot of the work. I was able to kind of get him to, for the first time ever, to speak with like a medical treatment facility that would allow him to be on his medication and allow him to do a medical detox. And I was able to connect him with them. But again, it's being able to meet people where they're at. Can I, for a long period of time, keep meeting with somebody that's under the influence? No. But is there a gray period ethically and with my licensure? I believe so. And if I can enhance that person's ability for change where they haven't been able to do that in 15 years, I'm going to work with them till I feel like I legally shouldn't.
What was the outcome for that gentleman?
So the outcome was that he went to inpatient treatment for a week and checked himself out. And when I met with him afterwards, I was like, wow, 15 years, you've been sober now for 7 days. Holy gosh. Talk about a glimmer. Mm-hmm. Now what? Now, how do we use that and say, we got here, so we know we can? But maybe that there was something that treatment center maybe needed to do a little bit differently, or maybe I needed to look at some resources, or maybe, I don't know, like, what are your ideas? Like, how can we maybe take this 7 days and build on it? So again, kind of reframing it in a way of 7 days, like that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a place to put another exclamation point or pause. For someone who is chronically using, life consequences, physical consequences, spiritual consequences, losses all over the place, to achieve 7 days sober after decades of use is tremendous.
Yes.
To the families, they see return to use after that as a failure, which I believe is the worst word we can use when we're dealing with the disease of addiction. Because if we truly believe it's a disease, how can one fail? How can one succeed and how can one fail? We don't talk like that around cancer.
No.
If somebody in remission and then the disease comes back, we don't say they failed. So I think we have to change our language as a society to look at, like you say, the accomplishment of that and acknowledging how hard that was and how much that person did. And you checked yourself out and all people would go, that's it, back to use, all bad. What I love is your way of thinking and reframing was, okay, how do we build on this? How did he build on it?
So he wound up, again, going to a different treatment facility and he did some more group work. So before, again, addiction can be so isolating. And this was an individual that was very like, no, I'm not listening to those other addicts. Like they're the crack one, again, it's these stereotypes. But once we're able to maybe say, we need to meet people where they're at, but kind of really be open to offering out of the box suggestions. I have one 25-year-old I work with, and it was very difficult for her to get sober from alcohol and benzos. One of the best resources she found on her own, when I kind of encouraged, I was like, you know what, let's both look, because there has to be other stuff out there than these online AA meetings. She found it was a neurodivergent sober book club in Charlotte, where it was, just all these like ranges of individuals that looked like her, that thought like her, that were all on this path of like sobriety, that were able just to kind of meet. And that was her group. That was her version of my sober social support, especially as a young individual today trying to get sober.
And I appreciate that we're talking about different people with different substances. And I would assume in that case with the young woman, you'd really have to be careful of the withdrawal, because as we know, alcohol and benzos are the most lethal. And a lot of families do not realize. We hear all of the talk about opiates and how awful it is to withdraw from them. And it is. They feel horrible. They also have all of their neurons changed to be completely unable to tolerate pain.
Mm-hmm.
The alcohol and benzo withdrawal will kill people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so important to realize that if your loved one is saying, I want help, to not try and force them to enter help sober and try and detox them yourself, but to allow them that medical detox to keep them safe. If they need to drink to get, let them. If they need to take benzos to get there, let them. And have it medical monitored so that you won't have to go through that and they may not lose their life.
Mm-hmm. And they're hard conversations to have, but the more that we have them, it becomes easier. It's like exposure therapy. When we expose ourselves to difficult things, it becomes like our bodies and our brain and our synapses, we become more calm and agreeable to them as we expose themselves to them more. So the more that we're able to have these difficult conversations about things that we don't want to, it becomes easier.
I agree. And let's look at the compassion to the families again, right? If I'm a loved one and I'm watching my person slowly die in front of me, at least disappear, at least isolate, whatever the consequences that are becoming more and more prevalent. The thought of pouring out enough alcohol to get them to help feels like I'm hurting them more. So it's really hard to imagine and put myself in the place of family. I like to try and be compassionate of like, okay, I want them off this so bad, but I need to do this to get them there safely. That's like, what am I doing? Right. And yet it is so important to do that.
Well, and I think too, what can be so helpful is just education. And education is out there. If there's anything, I mean, Margaret, I feel so blessed to be on here because I have learned this whole new slew of just tools out there that I can now share with my families. I mean, when I was looking up just like harm reduction in North Carolina, I found some coalitions where there's family support groups with like the Narcan. There's all these free videos by medicinal providers on how to administer it, on when to like administer it. There's all this stuff here on like tapering. It's also being able to work with a clinician. If you are trying to wean off of prescription opiates, benzos, things like that, that's also something that that provider should legally be, helping you with as far as what's safe and what's not safe, what's adverse, what do we look for? I found so many just blogs from like individuals that have lost people that said, I wish I knew about harm reduction. And hearing some of these, they're heart-wrenching that they almost feel like a person's life was taken from them because they didn't know that there was other ways. And that I did a disservice by saying, you stop or you're out of the damn family. And then that's it. It's hard because it's a gray area. It's messy. It's also case by case. It's individualized.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the tragedy of loss, of illness, any illness, absolutely addiction, is so complex. There's a grief. There's a secondary grief. There's tertiary grief. There's the reality of woulda, coulda, shoulda. In working with families to understand that they're doing the best they can with what they know in reaching out to help with who they get it from and what they learn and do. I don't believe any family member has the power to make a person with the disease of addiction use or not use. That is intrinsic to teaching families, because they will always feel guilt if their addicted person is yelling at them saying, if you didn't do this, I wouldn't have to use. That's the disease lying to them and to you. And I think that families have to have that awareness to then say, okay, if I know that's true, even though it's really hard to believe, what options do I have to help me navigate this torture that I feel about what's right or wrong, how to help, how to not help, what's healthy for me, what's not healthy for me, because I'm so preoccupied with someone else, I don't even register what I need.
It's interesting, and I love that this is geared towards families, because even whenever I'm working with any individual in addiction, and if I'm able to engage with their family, and especially if the family wants to engage for me, like with me, or they're like, just at a loss, I always start by saying, this is so huge that y'all are even here. I can't imagine how hard this has been for you, and the fact that you're still here. And I'll say that in front of the family, in front of the person with the addiction. And I put that out there. And even right then, it's a place for me to meet them where they're at. And sometimes I'll also hear from families, like when I call them brainstorming sessions. I'm like, y'all, I need your help because I'm not in the home. So what we're going to do is we're going to brainstorm some ways. And sometimes, and I'll hear this probably like maybe 40% of the time. Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think about that. How have I been doing this? And I'll say, stop. You must be kidding me. And I'll say, you're actually triggering me. Talk about triggers. Absolutely not. We have gotten this far. How y'all have done it on your own, I have no idea. Now, here I am. I'm just another tool. I'm like a resource, but it's you guys and you've made it. We're just looking at maybe a way to make it a little bit easier.
Heather, I love that, because it also takes the professionals in the work off of this pedestal that are often put on and say, I'm a tool in your toolbox. I may have skills and knowledge you don't have. I'm also more objective because I'm not living in the system. You all are the experts of your family, and you're letting me in to understand the system so that I can throw different suggestions that you can look at. If you weren't courageous enough to walk into this office and put yourself out there, we wouldn't even have this opportunity. And you made it to this point. And it's so important to validate the effort, the tenacity, the resilience, the love that families have for each other. Even if it's messy, even if mistakes are made, it's incredible to me, the people that survive this illness and how it impacts every family member when the disease becomes a family member.
I really appreciated this conversation with Heather as we discussed care and being client-centered. It was a great reminder that any care, treatment, outpatient, counseling, coaching has to be individualized and driven by the needs of the client. Though we desperately want black and white because it's so much less complicated, this disease is gray, and it's important to remember that as we move forward in our recovery. Come back next week when Heather and I will talk about new and fresh emotions that come with recovery and how to cope with these as a family.
I want to thank my guest for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you